let's move into our second panel. I'm pleased to introduce this panel that is titled Covering Diversity in the Media. We have three panelists: Jair Hilburn, who is a journalist and assistant editor at Forbes; Hank Klibanoff, who's professor of practice at Emory University and director of the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory; Aly Jackson Jolly, who is assistant managing editor of Forbes Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion; and moderator Jared Council, senior editor of Forbes The Culture.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about media coverage of diverse groups, primarily people of color, why it matters, and how reporters and editors should think about it in practice. Before we dive in, I think it makes sense for our panelists to give a brief snapshot of what they do and why. Aly, we'll start with you.
Hi, so I'll try to be brief because I am so much more interested in hearing everyone else's answers than my own, but I am Aly Jackson Jolly. I'm an assistant managing editor at Forbes. I was brought on to oversee our DEI initiatives, including our pipelining program to bring more diverse reporters to our newsroom. A little after I started, that role was expanded to also oversee our DEI content and communities, including Forbes The Culture, which, as you know, is our platform for Black and Brown entrepreneurs and professionals. And the very quick thing I'll say is I like to tell people that the reason I'm here, the way I was brought here, is important to me because it sort of is reflective of the kind of change I think that newsrooms have to make and really industries have to make in order to create more diversity, which is, to get away from that excuse, which is to say there just aren't enough good candidates out there, and instead to look at candidates with different experiences because I'm a leadership editor in the leading global media company in the world, and yet I didn't grow up in a newsroom. And a couple of years ago, there's no way I would be in this role, not even just because of the way I look or my gender, but because I didn't have 20 years in a newsroom. Instead, I started on Capitol Hill in politics and policy. I got my MBA. I worked in branding for a while. And then when I had my kids, I freelanced for about a decade. And then when we went through the summer that we did last 2 summers ago now, I made a promise to myself that I'd find a way to create change in newsrooms. And our chief content officer, Randall Lane, interviewed me. And when he did, he acknowledged that I wasn't really the typical candidate that he would bring in, but he thought that there was time, unless we were going to have a zero-sum game, I think were his words, where he stole an AME from another newsroom, he wanted to begin to make that choice to look at experience in a different way. And so here I am.
Sounds good. Jair, what about you?
Hi, so can't call my tongue, but I got my start at Morehouse College. I graduated from there in the year 2020, and then afterward I was acquainted through Aly, actually, and she introduced me to the Forbes Fellowship, and now I am a full-time hire as an assistant editor for Leadership and Communities team.
All right, and Hank, what do you do and why?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be part of this. First of all, I'm impressed by the first panel I heard, and sort of wanted to let that rest. It was just so terrific. I teach at Emory University now. This is a second career for me, and I'll come back to that in a second. I was a journalist for the first 35, 36 years. I'm 97 years old, by the way. And I was a reporter in Mississippi, and then at the Boston Globe, then Philadelphia Inquirer, and I was also became an editor there. And I was in Chicago as a national correspondent, and then I came down to Atlanta to become managing editor for news of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And then after that 36-year run or whatever, I came to Emory University and was very fortunate. I had this idea from some work I'd been doing in the South with other journalists to create a a project called the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project to train students to examine unpunished, racially motivated killings that have taken place in Georgia's history. And I've been doing it since 2010, and it's been, or 2011 actually, and it's just been terrific. The students have made some amazing finds. Most of the perpetrators are, virtually all are dead, so we're not able to bring people to the bar of justice, but we are able to bring the judgment of history to bear against some of these people who perpetrated such horrific crimes. That evolved into a podcast produced at WABE NPR here in Atlanta, called Buried Truths. And we're working on the 4th season now, and that's been surprisingly popular, surprising to me. You hear your own voice and you say, oh no. And the only other thing that I would say is that I had the great privilege of writing a book about the news coverage of the civil rights movement.
The Race Beat, right?
Called The Race Beat, right.
Mm-hmm.
And my co-author, Gene Roberts, invited me into it after he won the contract. And then, magically, just like 12 years later, 15 years later, it was done and we got it published.
Yeah.
So
awesome. Yeah, we're going to lean a little bit on your historical purview here shortly. Aly, I want to circle back to you with sort of the question of the day. Why should newsrooms, especially business journalism outlets, why should they care about covering diverse groups?
Yeah. And so, I think anyone who works in news right now knows the answer. I think actually even anyone who just consumes news knows the answer to this. And that is that, our newsroom, we failed. Like we failed our audience collectively, all newsrooms did. And if you don't believe it, look at the fact that when you ask people how confident they are in whether journalists are telling them the truth or not, confidence is way down. And if you ask people, who do they believe? They believe the networks that lean toward the same ideologies that they believe in. And that's not what news is meant to be, right? Our audience, like everyone who's been to journalism school, everyone who's worked in a newsroom knows your customer is your audience. You are there to serve your audience, not to make somebody look good, not to, push forward, an ideology or anyone's what they want to push forward. It's really to make sure that we are telling the stories that are out there. And so I think that this moment that we've all faced together has made us realize that unless we change something, unless we're all new, like serious news, not entertainment newsrooms, but serious newsrooms, unless we're able to gain that trust back and tell the stories more globally, making sure that we're telling them from all perspectives, then we're just gonna, we're gonna continue to go down the hill. And so for me, that means that we need to have more diverse perspectives in the newsroom. It means that, we need to have, no matter how hard I think somebody, if everyone has the same background, no matter how hard they try to tell all the stories and be as unbiased as they can and make sure they're hitting all the right points, it's just not possible. You need to have that diversity of lived experiences and perspectives, so that as a newsroom, we can be more holistic and telling the news and covering stories that need to be covered.
Yeah. And Jair, what attracted you to business journalism, and how do you see your role and responsibility as it relates to diverse stories?
For me, what attracted me to business journalism really is, in fact, journalism itself. I've always just loved journalism and every single factor of it. Put me in it, love it. I will be honest, I don't know much about business journalism, but for me, what motivates me, my why, is other people's why. After being here, you've learned that there are so many reasons people do what they do. There are many reasons behind why people start these businesses. And when you look at that reason, it becomes a little bit more inspiring in some cases, because you're hearing so many people that want to make this world a better place and are actively doing it. But then also you get to just spread this information to other people, because we sometimes just live in our own little bubbles. But thanks to the world we live in, the 21st century, we can communicate with people all around. And there are so many stories out there that need to be heard, and they deserve to be shared. And we as journalists are storytellers, we are documenters. And that's not to say we're creatively coming up with these things, but we're trying to see the creative way to tell this story, what's not being told and what's not being seen. Because we are some people's first introduction to information. And sometimes we may be people's last, but wherever we're at in that conversation, we need to make sure that we're adding as much to the conversation as much as people are taking away from it.
Got it. Yeah, Hank, you've been telling stories, including stories about Black America, since the early 70s. I'm curious. I mean, even in your book, you talked about this sort of evolution of how the mainstream media covered Black America, coming out of the civil rights era. Could you talk a little bit about what you meant by that evolution?
Sure. A couple of quick examples that I can think of. When on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the Montgomery bus, the Montgomery Advertiser had a newsroom, obviously very filled with white guys, and there wasn't a single person there who had the name of a single Black person in what we think of as the Rolodex in their address book. The one person who did have some names of Black people happened to be I think it was city editor, and it's because he owned property in the Black neighborhood, and those were his tenants, okay? But generally, and so the first night that the Montgomery Advertiser went to the Montgomery Improvement Association, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and saw a young man named Martin Luther King speaking, they quoted him. In fact, they misquoted him, because we have, we can listen to the audio and see they got it wrong, which journalists sometimes do on a quote. They're writing fast, but the way they misquoted him made him look more hysterical and radical than he was. But good thing for Martin Luther King, they didn't know who he was. So they just said, one pastor said, And so I think that is an argument, obviously, for diversity. It's also an argument for better reporting. Every white reporter should have the names of every important Black person on their beat. You know what I mean by every. And I think the other thing that changed. I'm always taken by the fact that, of course, by 1964, after years and years of the struggle and journalism covering it. I mean, the first national reporter came here in the South, 1947, a New York Times reporter. He was not the most aggressive, but, he raised the issue. And it was it leads us up to 1964 after the bombings and the burnings and everything, and we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And then a year later, we get the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Up until that point, these are mostly white reporters for the white-owned press, Black reporters for the Black-owned press, and the white reporters are welcomed in the Black community. In almost every Black community, they were welcomed because the Black community understood that they loved the Pittsburgh Courier, they loved the Norfolk, they loved the Black press, American, but they knew that to get the word out, they needed somebody from the New York Times or the Washington Star or the Washington Post or any of the major national publications. And those were almost all entirely white reporters. One of those was Carl Fleming with Newsweek, tall, handsome, Hollywood handsome guy who traveled the South, mostly with Claude sitting at the New York Times. And they'd roll into town and were very familiar with the Black community and very welcome. Claude, a couple of years later, finds himself after Selma and after the Voting Rights Act passed. And if you recall, it was within a week that Watts exploded. And you would hope that every newsroom in America said, have we been missing the story? Have we been missing the story? Carl Fleming goes out to Watts, and he's going into the Black communities expecting to be welcomed. Here comes the national press, Newsweek, and they beat the living hell out of it. Some of the Black people there were so angry, and they hit him over the head. You can see his blood, drenched body on the ground. it was it had changed, and no one saw that change coming, and that's a shame. And that maybe, I think, is because the newsrooms were not diverse enough to hear the voices.
Wow. Yeah. Aly, I want to bring you in here. I've been a reporter for 11 years, and I can remember a time where it just seemed like there wasn't much editorial interest in certain stories about Black communities, whether it was food deserts or disparities in health and education. And now there seems to be more attention and more of an audience. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so first I'm going to do what I hate when panelists do when I'm moderating. And I have to just jump back to that other question about why business journalism, because I should have said, Jair, I loved your answer. And I should have actually said, for me, one of the best answers when I talked to Jared, who came from the Wall Street Journal, about before he came to Forbes, about why he why business journalism was important to him, how he got into it. There are so few Black business journalists, there's so few Black digital journalists, and then you add the lens of business over that, and there's almost very, very, very few. And Jared said to me, because business stories are the stories of the power stories today. If you don't believe it, look around, see, the industries, who is really impacting society and impacting, the economy. It's businesses. So number one, that's a little plug for all of you young and aspiring journalists that are trying to decide which way to steer your careers, steer it towards business journalism. Another reason is because we are more agnostic than other industries. And so we have readership from across like every political spectrum. So anyway, sorry for being naughty. Back to your question, which was, why does there appear to be more of an appetite today? And I think that the answer is, the answer is in how you phrased it, it is just an appearance of more interest, because, diverse communities were always interested in the stories that were out there. And we know from all the demographic information that the Black and brown Americans are no longer minorities. So there's always been at least 50% of our population that's interested in the stories that impact them, about them. I think in the past, newsrooms did not have enough diverse journalists who could suss that out and realize that there was an appetite for those stories. And so those stories were being told in, to Hank's anecdote, in the Black newsrooms, right? They were just only being told in newsrooms that that Black and brown readers were going to, because they couldn't find that information in the other newsrooms. And so I think that it's not so much of a matter of all of a sudden there's interest. I think it's a matter of all of a sudden America newsrooms waking up to the idea that there is an interest, and this part of the audience, we need to serve them better and tell these stories better.
Yeah. And Hank, when it comes to the mainstream media sort of missing out, are there any parallels between, your early days as a reporter and kind of what you've seen in this era?
I think there are, and I really appreciate that. Very good question. I'm going to join Aly in cheating here a little bit. And it's just an interesting thing that I think people will find interesting. First of all, I was a business editor for a while, and I didn't know anything about business. And I said, why me? And they said, news. You just know news, and you'll be surrounded by editors who can do the earnings reports, who understand that sort of thing. And we ended up having a great run. It's at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we owned page one. Like every third day, we'd have a page one story from the business department. So I was very proud of that. I might also say that here's what's interesting historically about business. In the white newspapers, like the Macon size newspapers and other newspapers in the South, the white-owned newspapers, when they wanted to circulate in the Black communities and they wanted to provide news for their Black readers, because they too represented money for the newspaper, and they wanted to add a page of, and I'm using the vernacular of the time, okay, notes from our colored neighborhoods or from our colored neighbors and things like our Negro neighbors and things like that. And how do you think, you can't just add a page to a newspaper. We're 2 pages. The configuration doesn't work on the press. You either have to add 4 pages or what. And so how do you think they did it? It meant they had to take something out of the newspaper that the white people got. You know what that was? It was the business page. There was a presumption, a misguided presumption that Black readers won't care about business news. I mean, that to me just captures how far off they were in their thing. And yet they think, the editors at the time were thinking, well, they were doing a service to provide Black news to Black readers. So it's just a very interesting dynamic. I don't think we make those kinds of mistakes now, not as egregiously. But do I feel like we are missing many, many, many stories? Yes. I mean, I think especially now that we've had newsrooms that have become diminished, in size. There are new outlets, but the diminishing of newsrooms in metro areas, I think, has led to fewer and fewer stories. So it's a problem to begin with, aside from even trying to make sure that your communities of color are covered. But I did feel like during the whole emergence of the immigration crisis and the threat to people being deported, that newsrooms were missing that story. They weren't inside the homes watching a family strategize over, if you get stopped by the police and they want to see your driver's license and they suddenly realize you don't have it, that you're not here legally, how are you going to call, who are you going to call to make sure mom and dad know it, and so your sister knows it, so no one's home when ICE comes there, or whatever it would be. And we sort of miss that dynamic, I think. I'm not saying no one ever did it, but you didn't see it very often.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, Jair, on this, related note, there is a lot of niche media out there. And so this 2-part question for you is, why should predominantly white news organizations care about diverse stories? And on the flip side, why should diverse reporters want to work there when they have all these options?
I think it kind of goes in contingency with what Hank said. First and foremost, when you have diversity in your newsroom, you have more of a bountiful of stories to pick from. And even with that, the one main story, we have this one story here, but then you can go on so many different tangents because you have so many people in there that can offer a perspective, that can offer their voice and a new voice to a conversation that we're having. So we're not talking in circles, but also we're consistently moving the story forward. And then even when you think about it, we have outlets like BET and other outlets that are geared towards specific audiences, but their outreach only goes so far. They may not have the same outreach as a place like Forbes, but the job for organizations like Forbes or any other places higher up is that we must also take on the responsibility to ensure that we're telling those stories, that we're also amplifying voices as well, because we have the platform to do so. And then when you think about future journalists wanting to enter spaces like this, it's because we are the future of the business. We are the future. And if we want to see the business to change, we have to be the ones to change it, because we are the ones to change it. We are talented, we are driven, we have insight, we have conversations that people didn't have at our age, and we can then help push that conversation forward. Not so much that it's our job or responsibility, but if you do want to pick up that mantle, you have every right to.
Yeah, we got about 5 minutes left here. We'll try to get to a few questions if anybody in the audience has one. But I want to circle back to Hank here. It seems like choosing to cover diverse stories or ask questions about certain groups of people has become political. Like you get accused of bias or wokeness, based on who and what you decide to cover. Hank, again, with your long view of history, why do you think that's become the case? Are you by default taking a side if you choose to advocate for diverse stories? What do you think?
I don't believe you are at all. I believe you're just being a journalist, and you're being a better journalist when you do that. I mean, you don't know who's picking up the paper every day. You can't hold a vote every single day on what people think of the paper, but you can be pretty sure that if people pick up the paper every day, or look onto your website to be, current, and they don't see themselves, they're not coming back. we hosted Atlanta, the National Association of Black Journalists convention here some years ago, and I was managing editor, and I was running the news meeting, and they sent 4 or 5 people into and basically they were a jury, and they were looking at how we were doing it. And as later said, they said, well, actually they were pleased, and we had a very diverse newsroom, and that was good. They said, here's what you didn't ask. When you were saying, okay, this looks like it's headed to page 1, this will be a good Metro front, this is a good sports, whatever. You never said, what are we going to look like? They said, one of the people said, you should be asking, of course I was asking the photo people what they're offering, the graphics people, but overall, what are we going to look like? And that is, to all of our readers, will we look like we're their paper or not? And boy, that was like an epiphany for me, okay? Because not that you don't think of that, but you don't crystallize it that way. So that was very helpful to me. And I think white reporters, it's incumbent upon them to ask that question. Editors of all colors and race, it's incumbent upon them to ask that. Because it used to be that it's because it was good business, and I'd still say it's good business, to serve your entire community, because start losing readers, start losing advertisers, and you can't charge as much for your advertising. And I'm not being, sorry, that's not the capitalist in me, I'm an editor, but that's the practicalist in me.
Yeah, but I have to say, I like that, because I always say when I created the fellowship program, I wanted to think about pipelining and bringing different reporters into our newsroom. I actually think it's helpful to think about it that way, because I always thought like Jair being in our newsroom makes Forbes better. I never wanted for him to come to our newsroom and for our newsroom to think, oh, we're giving Jair an opportunity. Jair was giving us an opportunity to cover our stories better and to serve our audiences better and to make more money, right? Because you're right, at the end of the day, Forbes is in this business to be a business of news, and we can do that better when there's Jairs in our newsroom who are helping us to be better at it. So I never mind. I know there's some debate about whether we should be thinking about it in terms of bottom line or not. For me personally, I think that I think that we should be thinking about how having diversity in any industry, but in our industry, the news industry, makes us better. And it's not about giving somebody an opportunity.
Gotcha. And last question, we'll go around the horn on this one. So try to keep it brief. What are the challenges and opportunities related to diversity, that are unique to this era? Aly, we can start back with you.
I'll be really brief. I think that the opportunities are endless because we've never done it well. So like the thing that I love, I love my job. I love this role because I am an optimist, and I'm also a bit of a, I really truly know, I believe, and I know in my heart that we can make this change. And the opportunities are endless because there's so much change to be made. There's so many new ways to think about it. We've never done it right. The challenge is for digital journalism is that we have to build a pipeline because, there are not, in digital journalism, there are not as many Black journalists in college right now who are looking to go into digital journalism, and even fewer into business journalism. So, that's why. So it's up to us if we want business journalists. If we want to have more diversity, we have to, get the message out that there's a reason that this is the industry. So that's my challenge.
All right, Jair and Hank, any final thoughts?
I guess for me, I think that the biggest challenge that right now is that there is now such a demand. It's now where to look, and it's a tough hurdle to overcome. Sometimes you have to be creative in where you look, but it just all comes down to where is the right place to look, and then what's right for you, and knowing what's best for you. Because at the end of the day, it is your career, so you have to make sure that you're doing the right moves for yourself.
Yeah, I guess I would say very quickly that the the biggest challenge for many news organizations is sustainability, being able to sustain themselves, and the reason for that is to impart confidence in their staff, that their jobs are going to be there and that they don't have to fight each other for the jobs, that and which brings up all sorts of difficulties, and that there is a long-term future in news. I just think that when you feel threatened, we know what happens, and we know how people outside the newsroom will use that as a wedge to divide people against each other. So I just think that there needs to be a feeling among news owners and newsrooms that this is a worthy enterprise. It's saving democracy, and we will save your jobs and make it work for everybody.
Got it. All right, thanks to all our panelists. I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Jair, Hank, Aly. That was terrific. Really interesting to hear these different perspectives. And I liked the kind of the quick fire wrap up there of everyone's kind of summary of what needs to happen right away. What are our action items? As we close, I wanted to share an action item with all of you. All of our audience members here wanted you to consider applying for upcoming opportunities at Forbes. We're currently accepting applications for a winter internship, a summer internship, several full-time staff roles, and the Forbes HBCU Scholars Program, which is part of Forbes' ongoing commitment to bring in diverse candidates and to establish a pipeline for journalists of color to enter the industry and succeed, like our panel was just talking about. The Forbes HBCU Scholars Program aims to prepare and support emerging journalists of color from historically Black colleges and universities interested in business journalism. And this past summer, we welcomed our first class of these HBCU students, and Jair was one of them. And you've seen now that he was recently hired and has been an all-star of that pipeline. I'm going to share in the chat a link where more information can be found and applications can be found. And I encourage you to share this with your communities, your students. We would love to receive lots of applications, and we've made a commitment to, even if there are applicants who we cannot hire, we will share them with our competitors, our friends in the industry. We'll try to find ways to keep lifting these voices. And I know we have some questions coming in. So if our panelists didn't already answer them in the chat, maybe by email or something like that, we can share a wrap up. And with that,
Catherine, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's go for it. Our panelists are still
so my former editor, Mizell Stewart, I don't know if he's still on or not, but yeah, he actually was a
Hey, Mizell.
gave me my first job, so big shout out. So he asked, and anybody can chime in on this one. He says, I never believe that journalists can truly be objective, and that our ultimate goal should be fairness, not this ideal that people can set aside all of their past experiences and perspectives and report in the news. What is your view, particularly as it relates to diversity in journalists of color? Hank, you're on my screen, so I'll talk.
Well, I'm just going to say that the word objectivity is problematic. I mean, if you look, the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics hasn't used the word objectivity as a goal in 28, 30 years, I forget exactly, okay? They went for fairness and accuracy, okay? Because in the aftermath of the Joe McCarthy, objectivity became very problematic for editors, because it handcuffed them, because the way that objectivity had worked before is Joe McCarthy can say what he wants and you can't challenge it unless you can find another senator who will challenge it. You can't say today is the 14th day in a row he's refused to open up that piece of paper and show you the names. That was just like considered disrespectful and all these other things. So Ralph McGill, one of my heroes, an editor here at the Atlanta Constitution for many years, he referred to it in a speech at Columbia to the cult of objectivity, that it just turned us into mindless robotic, conveyors of whatever information was handed out to us. So now how it relates to, is it more troubled now because reporters of color may want to speak out more. I think it might be more problematic now. I'm not advocating reporters starting off with the I. I covered the trial on Ahmaud Arbery yesterday. Here's what I think. I think the lawyer for the is a nut. I mean, you can't do that. That's not what we're looking for. But I do believe it could have. There can be more aggressiveness in reporting if objectivity is not known as the goal.
All right, Aly or Jair, y'all want to chime in, or should we end it there?
I think let's end it there. I think, I think that Hank is really truly one of the experts on that. So there's no way I'm going to follow that up after he went. But yeah, no, I mean, thank you for, everyone for watching, and for Jared for moderating this. And yeah, to be continued. Hopefully we'll have more of these great conversations.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us on behalf of Forbes and Emory. Thanks to our panelists, and this concludes our session. Hope you have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for your questions. We'll look at them.
Take care, everybody.